But perhaps in the next 30 to 50 years, you may see China becoming more and more of the superpower that the United States once was, but in a different way. Economically, for sure. The weakness in China, though, and there is a tremendous flaw in the system, is raw materials. They are desperate for raw materials. They've been seeking them around the world. They are desperate for petroleum. They're competing with us tremendously for petroleum. They're adding 1 million cars. I forget what the statistic was, every month or so in China. They need the petroleum to fuel their economy. They're looking for alternate sources of fuel, alternate sources of energy. They are desperate for that, which they don't really have. Most of that country is desert. People don't realize that about China, but most of that country is not arable land. They've burned most of their trees. They have very few trees. They don't really have a lot of livestock in the Western sense of having acres and acres of cattle. They don't have this in China. So they have a different economy and a different approach to energy utilization. This may be a strength in the long run, but right now it's a weakness in the country.
I mean, the Soviet Union failed, and with that many people have said that the communist experiment failed. And the question, of course, is even though you have a system like this coming in with suppression and all that, and you mentioned that capitalism isn't democratic in that sense, and I would say neither is communism. And the question then is, if this runs its course, so to speak, the question is, how do you prevent people then from ultimately rising up if you're looking from the point of view of being the leader of a nation like this, or trying to manage such a huge population and still having a dictatorship in there? Because ultimately the better people get it in China, I would reckon that more and more would stand up. They would demand, to get equal rights and vote issues and all this stuff. Is that something you think that they want to give to people, or do they need to suppress and keep the dictatorship in place, so to speak?
Well, from my point of view, I think what the Chinese are doing is they realize something that we used to do back in the old days is to rely on bread and circus. As long as they feel that the Chinese have enough to eat, as their people have enough to eat, and they're entertained, and they're distracted by these material benefits that they've been getting, and they are growing a middle class in China. There was not a middle class even 30 years ago. There was no middle class, but now there's a growing middle class. I think as the government feels, as long as everybody is actively involved and distracted, no one's going to demand the right to vote. No one's going to demand all of these various liberties, because China can always point to the West and say, look what happened over there. You don't want to, go through this again, do you? So they remember their own history very well. They remember how they were suffering under the emperors and then suffering under various forms of foreign intervention. So I think they have a tendency to support their government and to give their government some space in which to move. There will always be people who will resist the government, and they will resist the kind of suppression that takes place. Falun Gong as being a famous example. Yeah. But I don't think in general, right now, I don't think the Chinese people are getting ready to cause any problems there. The only people who are going to be very angry, and they are right now, are the people who are poor, the people that used to have jobs under a state-controlled economy, what they call the iron rice bowl. It meant your rice bowl could never be broken because you'd always have a job. You were guaranteed an income for life. That has stopped for the large part. There are still some state-controlled enterprises, but for the most part, that's gone. So you've created this entire class of people who have no skills, who, while they were working in factories, really did basically nothing, that I can attest from having visited so many factories and seen so many workers sort of just sitting around. So they have no skills, they have nothing to contribute, but also no opportunity. And that's going to be China's big task. That's why they're creating so many social programs right now, is to try to stop this before it becomes a political problem for them. They don't need a couple of million Chinese. And in China, a couple of million is a couple of percentage points. But they don't need a couple of million Chinese suddenly deciding to revolt. That they don't need. So they're wise. I've been watching China, and they just have yet to make any mistakes in the last 20 years or so. They've been kind of, except for Tiananmen Square, which, we contributed, America contributed that to some extent, to the bad feelings over it. But Tiananmen Square is probably the litmus test for the government and how they're going to handle that in the future, if they're going to come out and say, yeah, it was a mistake. If they do that, I think a lot of Chinese will breathe a sigh of relief and will get on with their lives. But Tiananmen Square is still a sticking point. And it was the students who caused that, who created that. It was students living in the cities who could not earn extra income to pay for rising costs in the universities. They're the ones who mistakenly thought that democracy and capitalism were the same. And that's why you had the Statue of Liberty in Tiananmen Square. They didn't really want democracy, I think, from my point of view. What they wanted was what they thought democracy could bring them, which was capitalism. Well, now they have capitalism.
Yeah, that's right.
So maybe they don't need democracy. You see, we'll wait and see. I mean, there are different people with different attitudes. We'll wait and see what their values become in the years to come. Their own culture has become dominant in the region. Chinese culture, Chinese popular music and literature, films have taken on a life and a strength of their own. So they're not importing as much from the West as they used to. They're not idolizing Western values as much as they used to. What they used to call spiritual pollution, which was virtually anything from the West. So now it's become a different thing. Now they're proud of their own culture, of their own capabilities, not only in making money, but also in developing culture. This is what creates a very strong country, and this is what we have to look at and observe very carefully in the years to come.
Yes, and regarding language and all this, and considering that there's many schisms then in the Chinese society, do you see that this the government will attempt to, I guess, centralize China more, or make it more homogeneous in that sense, that they will try to bring it more together? And adding on to that question, is there any talk at all in China on larger expanding unions, like for instance the North American Union or the European Union, but in the Chinese or Asian context? Do you know?
Sure. Both of those questions are linked. In the first place, China, because of Mandarin. They have been using Mandarin as the official language in all of China. When I first went to China, and I was in South China, in Guangdong province, Canton province, I used to see these big signs that said in Chinese, "Comrade, please speak Mandarin." So they were trying to force everyone to speak Mandarin. That was supposed to be their universal language. And then leaders of the provinces were moved around considerably to make sure that there were Mandarin-speaking sort of northern Chinese people controlling the southern provinces and the other provinces around China. And then there was movement of people within China. Until recently, when you graduated university, you were told where you were going to work, in what part of China. You were sent there. That was your work unit, as they say. And you had a little book, and that was connected to where you worked. That was your identity. You worked in that factory, and it could be on the other side of China, and you may never see your birthplace again, except maybe on a holiday if you could afford the train ticket back. So there was this desperate attempt to homogenize China. It began with the emperors, with the use of the written language. But then with Mao, it really became very, very necessary. The Russians did the same thing in Ukraine and Belarus and those places. They imposed their language, they imposed their culture, and tried to eradicate the local cultures. Well, the same thing was happening in China. And at this point, it's been kind of successful. I would say about 50-50. I mean, you're still going to hear Cantonese in Canton province. There's no getting rid of it. Shanghainese in Shanghai, et cetera, et cetera. They're still speaking their own language amongst themselves. But to foreigners or to officially in government circles, it's always going to be Mandarin. So that's kind of worked. But as far as an Asian union, of course, the Japanese tried that during World War II. There was an attempt by China. They've been active participants in Asia-Pacific meetings and conferences. They're there all the time. They're kind of sinister to some of the countries. They're afraid of Chinese influence because they're so powerful. But at the same time, I think that China has shown itself to be more of a friend to Asia in general than a friend to anyone else. So I think the Asians are feeling a bit more comfortable having China sit on the board of these Asia-Pacific conferences and meetings and the various annual meetings they have throughout Southeast Asia, for instance. So I think that China's presence is there, and I think that there is a desire to create a kind of NAFTA for Asia, a free trade system of free trade arrangements. They're already involved with free trade discussions in South America and in Africa and the Middle East. So